Welcome everyone to another issue of It's Verona. This time we have the incredible honor to have Mrs. Vicky Pryce. She is one of Britain's top economists and business consultants. She has been a visiting professor at a number of really renowned universities, has been head and fellow of multiple business organizations, trusts and committees, and also she was a joint head of the UK government economic service, and she's the author of It's the Economy Stupid and her latest Women versus Capitalism. Mrs. Pryce, once again, thank you so much for being here today. You do not know how honored we are to have you here as a guest. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you.
So, Mrs. Pryce, we would like to talk about your latest book, which is very, very interesting. It's titled it's called Women and Capitalism. You argue that women are still kept out of top jobs, for capitalism cannot fully bring real gender equality. May I ask you, why is that? And according to your personal experience, what is the UK like in this respect?
And what I'm arguing in the book is the whole gender equality issue from an economic perspective. I'm saying that we're not using women across the world in the optimum way, so we're misallocating resources. And the reason we're doing that is because there is a clear market failure. There are obstacles being put in the path of women getting the positions that they should be getting, even going to work at all. If you look across the various nations, what you find is that there are prohibitions in terms of women even having their own bank accounts. In parts of the world, quite a lot of them still, you have to ask permission from your husband to work. Actually, it was still going on in Western Europe until maybe half a century ago. So we haven't escaped that ourselves at all, but at least we got out of it a bit earlier. But there are other obstacles that are out there. Property rights are not actually put into proper law in a number of countries and prevent women from working. They're not allowed to do particular types of jobs. In some cultures, they're not allowed to do night shifts, for example. They're not allowed to travel the distance that's necessary, or they are just confined home. And in many parts of the world, they don't get the education that they should be getting. So there is a big gap between them, therefore, and the men. And what tends to happen, of course, is that they lose out in terms of labour force participation, and, of course, in terms of pay and position in society. And that affects them across, not just economics, of course, and household well-being, but also, of course, they're not represented in decision-making, they're not represented in politics, but also because they end up being the ones that get paid worse or not at all, because they tend to spend much more time than the men looking after their family or caring for others. They're also the ones that are most likely to fall into poverty in any case, but particularly if there is a crisis, like the one we have now through the COVID pandemic. And it is the women who are suffering most in terms of job losses. It's also the women who are the front line, very often workers in the health sector, and they're the ones also have been affected most. And they're also the ones who, with lockdowns all across, have been more or less delegated to look after their families and children, and therefore making it very, very hard for them to carry on working. And therefore, the fall into poverty is considerably more likely as a result for the women than it is for the men in this particular crisis we're going through right now. So my argument is all these market failures require extra government intervention. What is happening, of course, in large parts of the Western world, in the UK as well, but also across Europe, is that you have additionally an extra market failure, which is the one which is caused by both conscious and unconscious bias, which basically keeps women out of particular areas of work, but also out of promotion. And we end up with very few senior women, so we don't have the models for the younger generation to emulate. If you look at all this, and then you look at the impact that this has on the economy more generally, it's quite extraordinary when you read the estimates of the International Monetary Fund, for example, as to the extent to which both welfare and GDP would increase very significantly if labour force participation by women was increased. So what we end up doing is more or less taxing women's work, making it more difficult for anyone to hire them because of all these obstacles, and basically raising the production cost of all the countries where that happens. You don't allow competition at various levels. That is another market failure. And you end up with women not contributing their input, if you like, into the production process in a way that would make the equilibrium that we reach in the world economy and in domestic economies as well become optimal. So we lose out in terms of growth, prosperity, productivity, and frankly, at the end of the day, also well-being.
Thank you.
Mrs. Pryce, thank you very much. It sounds really fascinating, and thanks again for joining us. There seems to be a lot of attention nowadays towards gender equality. So we were going to ask you, considering what you discuss in your book, what could be done to improve gender equality that hasn't been done already in capitalist societies?
Well, the reason why the book is called Women versus Capitalism is because the system itself doesn't price in all these externalities that I've just mentioned. The positive impact of having more women working at their skill level or educating them so that they can work at the skill level that contributes to society, or the negative externalities of not using the women, which actually detracts from productivity, growth, etc. Not just in relation to your own firm, for example, where you might not be employing the women as you should perhaps do, but also the impact that it has for the economy and society as a whole. So there's an externality there that is not priced into the system. That's more or less the same as if we're looking at, for example, climate change, where that itself is not priced in properly. What you need, therefore, is intervention from government to price that in. So in the case of climate change, you need a carbon tax. You need a pricing mechanism to do the right thing. In the case of women, the pricing mechanism, you don't pay them very much. That perhaps will correct itself. It doesn't work that way because, first of all, they're not skilled. They're not at the level that we want them to, quite often because you basically ignored it. But also, in order to bring these women in, you have to fight quite significantly against some of those obstacles that exist, particularly unconscious bias that is there. So it doesn't happen by itself. So what we've seen is that the best way for women to achieve gender equality, and every step of the way where gender equality has got better, it has been through government intervention. So you can't leave the system to do it itself. You're going to have to legislate. That's precisely what's been happening in the world. When you look at the World Bank assessment that they make every year, they're seeing a number of countries actually withdrawing legislative obstacles to women working, and that improvement happens that way. It does not happen naturally. And for an individual firm, in order to change the way it does business and to keep women who join in large numbers, very often, with good degrees, for example, in terms of professional firms, but then they all disappear. You need to invest. You need to invest in changing the culture. You need to look a lot more at supporting with childcare. You may need to look a lot more at having more flexible working, and maybe that what the experience with COVID-19 might get us there a bit faster. You need more perhaps sort of part-time work, but actually properly remunerated, because women who work part-time tend to earn an awful lot less than per hour than men who work full-time. So that's a serious issue we need to bear in mind. It shouldn't be like that. You should still be able to get trained and be involved in the proper run of business, even if you do it part-time, or job sharing, which is beginning to happen quite a lot. But it is really very expensive for a firm to change its culture by itself, because obviously that's an investment in the way in which it operates. They won't do it unless they're forced, even though the long-term benefits are there, very clear. More diversity of any sort is good news. Not losing the women we've invested in for a bit. Well, they first joined, you trained them up to a point, and then they all leave because of those biases. I mean, that doesn't make any business sense. but yet it doesn't get done to the extent that you'd want to see it, hence the pay gap, hence the position gap. You need legislation, and it is through equal pay, equal opportunity acts, forcing firms to be more transparent, to publish their wage differentials between men and women, to be much more open in terms of decisions that they make. These are the areas where government intervention can make a significant difference, and it is the way in which it has made a significant difference. We're still a long way from gender equality. Very few countries can claim to be more or less there. It's mainly the Nordic countries in Europe, but even they still have gaps, or significant gaps. So we do need, I'm afraid, when you have a market failure, you do need the government intervention to sort it out. The market will not do it by itself, hence the title in my book.
Mrs. Pryce, given exactly what you're saying, right, do you think that Brexit might have an impact on this type of gender equality, or maybe should I say inequality?
Well, the truth is that Brexit, a little bit like COVID, although COVID, of course, has made very substantial difference to growth in the short term, but you will recover in the longer term with a bit of luck. But Brexit means lower growth in the long term. And when you have lower growth in the long term, then you have the impact that I mentioned earlier. When you don't grow, it is the people at the bottom end who are the ones that suffer, and it is women who earn a lot less and get ghettoized in particular sectors of the economy that suffer most. And that's the problem. What you need is redistribution, if you like, and much more emphasis on education, and also raising, to a considerable extent, the ambitions of people, actually taking some of those ambitions away, because we're going to be a slower growing economy, if that indeed is what happens, is not going to help women at any particular rate that I can see.
Mrs. Pryce, you're obviously focusing on the economy, also on other economic areas, of course, and so we wanted to take the chance, given your experience, to talk more broadly about Brexit and COVID-19, and more specifically, what's the impact on the British economy of these two phenomena?
Well, what you're seeing right now is that GDP output has been falling very substantially. So we have figures for March and April. The April fall was something like 20% month on month, after a 5% fall in April. If you look at it over a year, it was 25% down. That's not very surprising. The lockdown has affected large sectors of the economy. There have been still industries that have done reasonably well. I mean, after all, the health area more generally, so pharmaceutical companies, but also IT, and all those critical care workers, they've all continued to be employed. The public sector has hired more people. And those key workers in transport and deliveries and the postal service and so on, they've all remained at work, plus a very substantial part of the service sector which didn't need face-to-face contact. And the interesting thing and very worrying thing in terms of how we emerge from this, because obviously we will emerge, and there's already some sign that output is recovering from the lows of April, so May and June. Purchasing Managers Index data that just came out is suggesting some pickup, actually quite a substantial one in June, as things have been opened up increasingly. But as you look at the impact of what some services, which will not be able to open in a hurry, or at least not the way they were before, might mean in terms of employment and growth, you also see that it is really the people at the upper end of the earnings scale who have been able to work from home and also retain their jobs. And it's extraordinary. It's not just in the UK, but there are similar data elsewhere. And I've looked at data in the US where it's exactly the same pattern. In other words, the more you earn, the more likely you are to have kept your job. The less you earn, generally, the less likely, with some exceptions in terms of the health service, which has been critical, of course, you're likely then to have lost it. And particularly sort of harshly hit has been the whole gig economy. All these people with contracts that were not particularly secure, paid for by the hour or with no fixed contracts, who have lost their jobs, and they are the ones who are probably likely to be among the last to be redeployed. But then, of course, we have some very large firms which are shedding labor, whether it's the airline sector, whether it's the manufacturing sector, particularly in the area of car production, where output has really been slashed. In the airline sector, of course, a number of companies just closed down for a while. And if you look at the entire entertainment, leisure, and a large part of the retail sector too, we've seen small and medium-sized enterprises in serious difficulty, and we expect the number of people unemployed to rise very significantly. So even though the economy is beginning to recover, we are quite concerned here that we're going to end up with many people who'll be looking for jobs and they won't be spending themselves. We'll be very careful in terms of what they do. So the chances are that the government will have to carry on supporting the economy, like in the rest of Europe, of course, and like in many other parts of the world, for quite some time to come.
Mrs. Pryce, thank you very much for sharing your views with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.